The Interstellar Survival Academy existed because someone, approximately 3,000 years ago, decided that watching pampered species flounder in hostile environments was both educational and hilarious. Located on a moon that had been specifically terraformed to contain every possible ecosystem that could kill you in interesting ways, the Academy churned out certified survival specialists who could theoretically last 48 hours anywhere in the known galaxy without crying for their mothers. Theoretically. The curriculum was simple, brutal, and had a failure rate that would make insurance companies weep. Drop cadets into nightmare scenarios, provide minimal equipment, extract them before permanent damage occurs. Repeat until competent or broken. The Academy's motto, roughly translated from ancient Krev'nak, meant something like adapt or die embarrassingly. It lost something in translation, but the sentiment remained crystal clear. Every species in the Galactic Cooperative sent their brightest, toughest, most resourceful younglings to this glorified torture facility. The Krev'nak, crystalline beings who could photosynthesize but still somehow managed to sunburn. The Vexori, slug-like creatures with enough redundant organs to survive a shuttle crash, but who panicked at room temperature fluctuations. The Threndil, bird-adjacent species with hollow bones and attitudes to match their fragility. Dozens of species, hundreds of variations, all convinced their particular evolutionary path had prepared them for anything the universe could throw at them. Then there were the humans. Humans had joined the Galactic Cooperative 70 years ago, and in that time had developed a reputation as the species most likely to do something statistically improbable while humming off-key. They had no natural armor, couldn't breathe methane, lacked the ability to see in infrared, and their reaction to most toxins was either mild discomfort or spectacular death, with no middle ground. By all reasonable metrics, they should have been categorized as delicate support species and given administrative roles far from danger. Instead, they kept volunteering for everything dangerous and then surviving through what could only be described as weaponized stubbornness and an inexplicable tendency to befriend things that should eat them. The Academy had started accepting human cadets 15 years ago. The results had been confusing. This particular survival exercise had been planned with mathematical precision. Drop Zone 73, a river valley on the moon's temperate continent, abundant water source, edible vegetation, mild weather. The kind of scenario where competent cadets could demonstrate resource management, water purification, shelter construction, and basic foraging. A milk run, as the humans would say, though why anyone would transport dairy products at high speed remained a mystery. Cadet Group Theta 9 materialized at the designated coordinates precisely at dawn. 16 cadets from 8 species, all 5th rotation students with exemplary records. They had survived the swamps, the deserts, the volcanic plains. A Riverside camping trip should have been a victory lap before graduation. The river was gone. Not low, not reduced to a trickle. Gone. Completely, utterly, impossibly dry. The riverbed stretched before them like an accusation, a winding scar of cracked mud and sun-bleached stones where 3 meters of flowing water should have been. The vegetation along the banks was brown, crispy, and looked about as edible as the Academy's legal disclaimers. For exactly 4 seconds, nobody moved. Then Cadet Krev'nak, a Krev'nak whose crystalline structure refracted light in anxiety-inducing patterns, activated his communicator with a limb that trembled visibly. Static, pure, unbroken static. He cycled through emergency frequencies. More static. The atmospheric interference that Command had casually mentioned in the briefing as a minor inconvenience, was apparently having a spectacular day. "No water," Cadet Threx announced, because Threndil officers felt compelled to state the obvious before having emotional breakdowns. His feathers began fluffing in what his species called a stress display, and everyone else called looking like he lost a fight with a pillow. "No communication," Krev'nak added, his internal light dimming to a sickly amber. "No plan for this scenario," whispered Cadet Mulvix, a Vexori whose entire body was already secreting the mucus coating that indicated existential dread. The panic started small, polite, almost organized. Then it metastasized. The Krev'nak cadets immediately began a geometric formation that was supposed to optimize resource sharing, but mostly just made everyone stand in an uncomfortable pentagon. The Threndil contingent launched into a hierarchical argument about leadership succession during crisis scenarios, which devolved into three of them refusing to speak to each other. The Vexori began hoarding their individual water rations with the intensity of stockholders watching a market crash. Cadet Prexil, a Xanthorian with too many eyes and not enough common sense, declared that they should immediately trek to the mountain range visible on the horizon, where snow presumably meant water. This was a spectacular idea if one ignored the minor details of the mountains being approximately 40 kilometers away across rough terrain, and the cadets having exactly enough supplies for a 2-day Riverside excursion. "We must conserve all liquids," announced Krev'nak, who had apparently elected himself crisis manager. "Strict rationing begins now. No consumption without group consensus." "Group consensus." Threx's voice climbed an octave. "By the time we achieve consensus, we will have achieved mummification." The Vexori cadets had formed a defensive circle around their water rations, mucus production increasing to levels typically seen before hibernation. The Krev'nak were attempting to calculate optimal survival probabilities using mathematics that required computers they did not have. Someone suggested digging for groundwater, which would have been reasonable, except nobody had brought digging implements, because the briefing had promised abundant surface water. An hour in, Cadet Mulvix attempted to drink his own stress mucus. It went poorly. 2 hours in, actual physical altercations broke out over who got to stand in the shade of the largest dead tree. 3 hours in, everyone agreed they were going to die. They just couldn't agree on the timeline or who was to blame. That's when the human showed up. Cadet Jackson Chen materialized at the coordinates exactly 3 hours and 17 minutes late, carrying a backpack that seemed larger than regulation and wearing an expression of mild confusion that his species apparently used for everything from "I am lost" to "I am being attacked by space bears." He surveyed the dry riverbed, the panicking aliens, and the general atmosphere of apocalyptic despair with the casual interest of someone who had taken a wrong turn and ended up at someone else's catastrophe. "Ha," he said, which in human dialect could mean literally anything. "River's gone." 16 pairs of alien eyes fixed on him with the collective energy of a firing squad. "The human states the obvious," Threx muttered. "How refreshing." "You are 3 hours late," Krev'nak accused, his crystalline structure flashing angry reds. "We have been attempting survival protocols while you did what, exactly?" Chen shrugged, a gesture that involved raising both shoulders in a way that communicated maximum indifference. "Found some interesting mushrooms about 2 clicks north. Possibly edible. Also possibly hallucinogenic. Won't know until someone braver than me tries them." "There is no water," Mulvix wailed, in case the human had somehow missed the defining feature of their crisis. Chen dropped his oversized pack and stretched in a way that made several vertebrae crack audibly, causing the Threndil cadets to flinch. Riverbeds don't just disappear though. Water's gotta be somewhere. The human suggests the water is hiding, Threx said flatly. Revolutionary. But Chen wasn't listening. He was walking along the dry riverbed with his head tilted, occasionally crouching to examine the cracked earth. His behavior made no sense to anyone watching. The water was objectively not present. Visual confirmation had been achieved. Further investigation was redundant. Then he stopped, stamped his foot against the ground several times, and nodded to himself like he'd just confirmed a suspicion. Underground, he announced. River's still here, just rerouted below the surface. Probably a geological shift. Happens all the time. You can hear it if you listen. He stomped again. Nobody else heard anything except the sound of a human foot hitting dirt. But Chen seemed satisfied. Right, he said, with the confidence of someone about to do something inadvisable. I'm setting up here. Setting up? Krev'nak's lights flickered in confusion. Setting up what? Kitchen, Chen said simply. Like this was the most obvious response to being stranded without water in a survival scenario. The silence that followed was the kind typically reserved for funerals or particularly devastating insults. The human has experienced thermal damage to his cognitive centers, Prexil concluded. Chen ignored this medical assessment and began unpacking his suspiciously large backpack with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. Out came a collapsible metal frame, a flat cooking surface that unfolded like aggressive origami. Something that looked like a shovel, but had clearly been modified beyond manufacturer specifications. Small containers of substances that might have been spices or might have been chemical weapons. With human food, the line was famously blurry. You cannot cook without water, Krev'nak stated, using the tone reserved for explaining basic physics to children. Watch me. Chen took his modified shovel and began digging at the exact spot where he'd been stomping. Not frantically, not desperately, just with the steady rhythm of someone completing a mildly tedious chore. The alien cadets watched because there was literally nothing else to do except continue panicking, and they'd already been doing that for 3 hours. 1 meter down, the soil changed color. 2 meters down, it was damp. 2.5 meters down, water began seeping into the hole. The collective gasp from 16 alien cadets could have powered a small generator. Chen rigged up a filtration system, using materials from his pack, some local rocks, and what appeared to be a shirt he'd packed specifically for this purpose. Within 20 minutes, clean water was trickling into a container at a rate that wouldn't win any races, but would absolutely prevent death. Groundwater, he explained while working, not even breathing hard. Rivers don't disappear, they just change location. Basic hydrology. That is not in the academy curriculum, Threx protested weakly. Yeah, well, I grew up in rural California. Droughts were kind of our thing. With water secured, Chen began the next phase of his inexplicable plan. He gathered dead wood from the deceased vegetation along the banks, selected stones of specific sizes from the riverbed, and constructed what could only be described as a cooking station. Not a survival fire, not an emergency heat source. An actual kitchen setup with multiple cooking surfaces, temperature zones, and organizational logic. The human is insane, Mulvix whispered, but he was watching very carefully. Chen lit a fire, using a technique that involved striking stones together, because apparently humans could create flames through percussion, like some kind of bipedal flint monster. The fire caught, grew and stabilized under his careful arrangement of fuel and airflow. Then he started cooking. From his pack emerged supplies that definitely violated the spirit of the survival exercise, if not the actual regulations. Dried ingredients that looked suspiciously pre-prepared, sealed packets that might have been emergency rations or might have been contraband, depending on how loosely one interpreted Academy rules. A small bottle of something liquid that absolutely was not regulation survival supplies. Olive oil, Chen explained, noticing the stares. Not technically required for survival, but neither is misery. He diced something that looked like the possibly edible mushrooms he'd mentioned earlier, apparently having decided that he was brave enough to risk the hallucinogenic option. These went into a heated pan with oil and a pinch of something from one of his mystery containers. The smell that emerged was unexpected. 16 noses, beaks and olfactory sensors perked up simultaneously. Chen added water to a pot, brought it to a boil, and added what he claimed were local greens that he'd gathered during his detour. The greens that everyone else had written off as toxic because they looked vaguely threatening. He added more mystery spices. The smell intensified, evolved, became something that bypassed the brain entirely and spoke directly to the stomach. "That smells like food," Threk said, his voice carrying accusation and longing in equal measure. "That's because it is food," Chen replied, stirring with a stick he'd whittled into a spoon, because apparently humans could just make utensils out of trees. The mushrooms came off the heat, perfectly golden. Chen plated them on flat rocks he'd cleaned and heated. He ladled the green soup into containers fashioned from large leaves. From another pocket dimension of his backpack, he produced something that looked like bread, which he toasted over the fire until it achieved a golden brown state that should not have been possible in a survival scenario. "All right," he announced, like he was hosting a dinner party and not committing culinary crimes against Academy protocol. "Who's hungry?" Nobody moved. Alien survival instinct warred with alien hunger. The food smelled incredible, which in nature was often a warning sign. But they were also very hungry, very dehydrated, and very confused about what was happening. Mulvix broke first, slithering forward with the dignity of someone who had abandoned dignity 3 hours ago. Chen handed him a portion of the mushroom dish without comment. Mulvix consumed it in one mucus-coated gulp, paused, and then made a sound that Vexori only produced during their happiest moments. That broke the floodgates. Within minutes, all 16 cadets clustered around Chen's Riverside kitchen like refugees at a charity buffet. He served them with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this before, explaining each dish as he went. Mushrooms sautéed with local herbs, definitely not hallucinogenic, probably. Green soup, high in nutrients, tastes better than it looks, which is a low bar. Toasted bread because carbohydrates are important and also delicious. The Krev'nak cadets discovered that human cooking generated heat that their crystalline structures could absorb while eating, making the meal doubly efficient. The Threndil found that the soup's temperature was perfect for their metabolism. The Vexori stopped secreting stress mucus entirely, which was the equivalent of a standing ovation in their species. "This violates survival doctrine," Krev'nak said, but his internal lights were glowing a warm, satisfied amber as he consumed his third serving of soup. "Does it though?" Chen asked, adding more wood to the fire. "I found water, foraged edible plants, created fire, prepared nutritious meals, and established a sustainable camp. That's literally every survival objective. But you made it look easy," Threx protested. "Survival is supposed to be difficult. Why?" The question hung in the air like a philosophical bomb. "Because," Threx fluttered his feathers in confusion. "Because struggle builds character." Pretty sure dying of dehydration just builds corpses, Chen replied, flipping more mushrooms. Look, I get it. Your species evolved on planets with different resources, different challenges. But humans? We evolved on a planet that was actively trying to kill us in creative ways. We didn't adapt by becoming stronger or faster or growing armor. We adapted by looking at every problem and asking, can I eat this, burn this, or make tools from this? Usually all three. He gestured at the Riverside kitchen with something that might have been pride or might have been exhaustion. With humans, it was hard to tell. A river disappeared. Fine. Find where it went. No food. Fine. Figure out what's edible. Survival isn't about suffering, it's about solving problems and then having dinner. Prexil, who had consumed enough soup to feed a small Xanthorian village, waved several appendages philosophically. The Academy teaches that hardship is the teacher. The Academy also charged you guys tuition to learn things humans figured out 10,000 years ago because the alternative was extinction, Chen pointed out. No offense to your ancient traditions, but spite and hunger are excellent motivators. As the sun set over the dry riverbed, the camp transformed. The panic was gone, replaced by something uncomfortably close to contentment. Cadets who had been ready to abandon each other 3 hours ago were now sharing food and comparing notes on human cooking techniques. Chen had started a second pot of soup because the first one had disappeared faster than a politician's promises. The fire crackled, the stars emerged, and the camp smelled like a restaurant instead of a disaster zone. Tomorrow, Krev'nak announced, his lights cycling through thoughtful purples, we should construct better water collection systems, improve the camp infrastructure. Perhaps hunt for protein sources. I saw some rabbit-adjacent creatures north of here, Chen offered. Looked edible, might be delicious. The human will teach us his hunting techniques, Threx declared, in the tone of someone issuing a command that was actually a desperate plea. Chen shrugged again, that universal human gesture of agreeable indifference. Sure, fair warning though, human hunting techniques mostly involve persistence, swearing, and unreasonable optimism. That sounds identical to human everything, Mulvix observed. You're learning. The extraction shuttle arrived 2 days later, precisely on schedule. The Academy instructors expected to find 16 exhausted cadets rationing water and practicing emergency protocols. They expected stress, conflict, maybe some minor injuries, and a lot of character development through suffering. They did not expect to find a fully operational Riverside cafe. The camp had expanded significantly. Multiple fire pits, organized food storage, a smoking rack for preserving meat, something that looked suspiciously like a primitive oven built into the riverbank. The cadets were well fed, hydrated, and appeared to have gained weight, which should have been statistically impossible in a survival scenario. Chen was teaching 3 Krev'nak cadets how to identify edible fungi while simultaneously explaining the concept of fermentation to a horrified Threndil. Instructor Krev'nak, a battle-scarred veteran who had survived 14 hostile planet deployments, stared at the scene with all 4 eyes. What? He said slowly. Is this successful completion of survival objectives? Krev'nak reported, snapping to attention. We secured water, shelter, and food sources, maintained group cohesion, adapted to unexpected environmental challenges, 0 casualties, 0 safety incidents. You built a restaurant. We built a sustainable camp using available resources, Threx corrected. The human showed us how. All eyes turned to Chen, who was currently draining a pot of something that smelled like it belonged in a five-star establishment, not a survival zone. The river was underground, he explained with his characteristic verbal efficiency. So I dug. That is not protocol, Instructor Krev'nak stated. No, but it is problem-solving, Vexori interjected, his lights flashing defensive patterns. Is that not the purpose of survival training? To solve problems? The instructor opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, and then made a gesture that in his species indicated cognitive overload. He retreated to the shuttle to consult with his colleagues, leaving the cadets to dismantle their camp. Chen started packing up his kitchen setup with the same efficiency he'd used to build it. The other cadets helped, moving with the coordination of a team instead of the chaos of competing individuals. Will we receive passing marks? Mulvix asked quietly. Don't know, Chen admitted. Pretty sure I violated at least a dozen academy regulations. On the other hand, everyone's alive and nobody ate anybody else, so that's got to count for something. You changed how we think about survival, Vexori said, his internal lights pulsing with unusual intensity. That must be worth something. Chen shouldered his mysteriously capacious backpack and surveyed the riverbank one last time. The fire pits were carefully extinguished, the camp area cleaned, the underground water source marked for future use. They were leaving it better than they'd found it. Survival isn't about enduring misery, he said finally. It's about living well enough to survive another day. My grandmother taught me that. She survived 2 wars, a famine, and raising 4 kids on a factory salary. She said any day you eat hot food and sleep safe is a day you won. He started walking toward the shuttle, then paused. Also, never trust a survival doctrine written by someone who's never actually been hungry. They tend to romanticize suffering because they've never experienced it. The other cadets followed him, abandoning the riverbank that had almost broken them and had instead fed them better than the academy cafeteria ever had. Instructor Krev'nak was still consulting with his colleagues when the cadets boarded. Through the shuttle windows, they could see heated arguments, gestures of confusion, and what looked like several instructors pulling up the academy regulations on datapads to search for relevant protocols. Do you think they will change the curriculum? Threx asked. Probably not, Chen replied, settling into his seat. Institutions don't like admitting that their traditional methods might be inefficient. They'll probably add a footnote about groundwater detection and call it innovation. That seems unjust, Vexori protested. Welcome to civilization. It's like survival training, but with more paperwork and worse food. The shuttle lifted off, leaving the dry riverbed behind. In the Academy's official records, Survival Exercise 73 would be marked as completed with irregularities pending review. The cadets would all pass. Eventually, after a committee spent 3 weeks arguing about whether establishing a functional kitchen violated the spirit of survival training, Chen would receive a formal reprimand for excessive preparedness and an informal commendation from several instructors who privately thought the whole thing was hilarious. But more importantly, word would spread. Through the academy, through the cooperative, through the endless network of species, trying to understand the bizarre humans who had joined their galactic community. The story of the cadet, who responded to a water crisis by opening a restaurant, would become legend, mutating with each retelling. Some versions would claim he'd cooked for 100 cadets. Others would insist he'd summoned the water through human shamanic rituals. A few particularly creative versions would involve him intimidating the river into returning through sheer attitude. The truth, as always, was simpler and somehow more impressive. A human had looked at a disaster, shrugged, and made dinner. Because apparently, that's what humans did. They saw the universe trying to kill them and responded by developing cuisines.